What if the most dangerous name connected to Ghislaine Maxwell was never meant to be spoken out loud? Not written down, not filed, not leaked in a courtroom document, just whispered. What if the real panic inside palace walls wasn't about guilt or innocence at all, but about something far more fragile? Belief. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Because belief is uncontrollable. Belief doesn't wait for evidence. Belief doesn't care about legal language, carefully worded statements, or royal silence. Belief spreads. And right now, belief is doing something the monarchy has spent centuries trying to prevent. It's asking questions, dangerous ones. For years, the public narrative surrounding Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell has felt oddly contained. A small circle of familiar names. One disgraced prince. One convicted accomplice. A scandal framed as isolated, tragic, and ultimately manageable. But insiders say that narrative was never meant to hold forever. Because behind closed doors, behind legal walls and public denials, there has always been a quieter fear. Not of what has been proven, but of what might be imagined. And that fear, according to multiple sources close to the fallout, has a name. A list. Not an official list. Not a document stamped or signed, but an alleged internal understanding. An unspoken map of associations, introductions, favors, overlaps, and proximity. And here's where the story shifts. Because the rumor isn't that this list exists in a drawer. It's that it exists in people's heads. And once that idea took hold, the palace began to do something it almost never does. It panicked. Ask yourself this. Why would one woman, already sentenced, already silenced, already written off, still terrify institutions that have survived wars, abdications, and revolutions? What leverage could possibly remain? The answer, according to those watching closely, is simple. She knows who is in the room. And more importantly, she knows who doesn't want to be remembered as having been there. This isn't a story about proof. It's a story about proximity. Because in elite circles, proximity can be more dangerous than participation. Being adjacent to scandal can destroy careers just as effectively as being at the center of it. Sometimes faster, sometimes more permanently. And that's why the whispers matter, especially when one name, unexpected, controversial, polarizing, keeps resurfacing in the same conversations. Meghan Markle. Now pause. Before reactions harden, before assumptions rush in, before defenses go up, ask yourself why that name provokes such an immediate response. Is it evidence? Or is it narrative gravity? Because some figures, fairly or unfairly, become lightning rods. They attract suspicion simply by existing at the intersection of power, disruption, and visibility. And insiders suggest that's exactly what makes this rumor so volatile. Not that Meghan is accused of anything specific, but that her alleged proximity to circles, events, introductions, people, creates a narrative vacuum the palace cannot control. A vacuum where speculation thrives. And speculation is what institutions fear most. According to multiple observers, the panic didn't start when Maxwell was convicted. It started when she stopped being useful, when there was nothing left to gain from her silence. Because silence, when it's expected, is comfortable. But silence that might break? That's terrifying. Here's what's important to understand. Powerful systems don't collapse from exposure alone. They collapse from uncertainty, from not knowing which name will trend next, from not knowing which association will be reframed, from not knowing whether tomorrow's headline will be about truth or perception. And perception, once unleashed, doesn't need permission. Sources close to royal crisis management describe a shift over the last few years. A subtle one. Fewer statements. More internal briefings. An unusual focus on reputational modeling. What would happen if a name appeared next to another name? What would happen if the public connected dots that were never meant to be connected? What would happen if the story expanded instead of shrinking? Because one disgraced prince can be managed. Titles can be removed. Roles can be erased. Distance can be manufactured. But a network? A network is harder. A network suggests pattern, and pattern suggests systemic risk. That's where the alleged number comes in. 9. Not because 9 has been confirmed. Not because 9 has been named. But because 9 implies scale. And scale implies something the palace has always fought against. A loss of narrative control. Think about it. Why would the idea of 9 unnamed figures cause more alarm than one named figure ever did? Because 9 reframes the story. It transforms it from a scandal into a structure, from an individual failure into an ecosystem problem. And once that door opens, it doesn't close easily. This is where Meghan's name becomes narratively explosive. Not as an accusation, but as a connector, a bridge between worlds, Hollywood and royalty, charity and celebrity, outsider and insider. Whether that bridge is real, imagined, or exaggerated almost doesn't matter anymore, because belief fills in the gaps, and belief doesn't wait for confirmation. Here's the contradiction at the heart of this entire panic. If nothing exists, why react at all? If there is no list, why fear it? If associations are harmless, why prepare for fallout? That contradiction is what fuels speculation. And speculation is what the palace cannot litigate away. Observers note that the response hasn't been denial. It's been silence. Careful, strategic, disciplined silence. But silence has a shelf life. And when people start whispering that Ghislaine Maxwell has nothing left to lose, silence stops looking like strength. It starts looking like vulnerability, especially when the public begins asking a different question. Not what happened, but who knows what happened? Because knowledge is power, and power, in the wrong hands, is destabilizing. According to insiders, the fear isn't that Maxwell will release a list. It's that she doesn't need to. That the mere suggestion of one is enough to keep institutions awake at night. Because once the public believes a list exists, every denial becomes suspect. Every absence becomes evidence. Every coincidence becomes confirmation. And that's how narratives spiral. Slowly at first, then all at once. Ask yourself this. Why does this story keep resurfacing now? Why do whispers grow louder instead of fading? Why does the palace seem more cautious, not less? Some believe it's because the old rules no longer work. Deference has eroded. Trust has thinned. And social media doesn't wait for official timelines. The moment people believe there is something to uncover, they start digging, even if they don't know where to look. And that's when institutions lose control. This introduction isn't about accusations. It's about atmosphere. A charged atmosphere where names feel dangerous, where proximity feels suspicious, and where silence feels strategic. And that's why this story matters now. Because the palace isn't reacting to facts. It's reacting to possibility. To the idea that history might be rewritten not by documents, but by conversations. Not by evidence, but by memory. And not by courts, but by public opinion. So the question isn't whether a list exists. The question is far more unsettling. What if it doesn't need to? Because once belief takes over, reality becomes negotiable. And according to those watching closely, the palace knows that. Which is why the real fear isn't exposure. It's imagination. And that fear is only just beginning. Because as this story unfolds, one thing becomes clear. Prince Andrew was never the end of it. He may not have even been the center. And once that realization set in, everything changed. What happens when the person everyone thought was finished stops being predictable? That's the question that began circulating quietly, long before headlines caught up. Not in public, not on social media, but in places where consequences are calculated in advance and panic is measured, not expressed. Because the moment people realized that Ghislaine Maxwell no longer had anything left to protect, the story shifted. Silence is powerful when it's voluntary. Silence is dangerous when it's assumed. And for years, silence was assumed. The public was told the chapter had closed. The case was over. Justice had been served. One woman convicted. One prince disgraced. A tragedy neatly boxed, labeled, and archived. But insiders say that sense of closure was always artificial. Because Maxwell was never just a participant in events. She was the archivist of relationships. The connector. The person who remembered who sat next to whom, who was introduced to whom, who laughed, who lingered, who left early, who stayed late. And memory, in elite circles, is currency. Ask yourself this. If you were present for moments other people desperately wanted forgotten, how valuable would your recollection be? Especially if no one could force you to forget. That's the uncomfortable truth institutions don't like to admit. Courts can punish actions. They can't erase knowledge. And according to those who've studied the pattern closely, Maxwell's real power never came from what she did. It came from what she knew. From years spent watching powerful people relax when they thought no one important was paying attention. From observing how differently people behave when they assume privacy is guaranteed. Because proximity reveals things that official records never will. And that's why the panic didn't peak at conviction. It peaked afterward. When the question shifted from what will she say in court to what might she say when court no longer matters. Think about the psychology of it. When someone is fighting a case, they're strategic. They calculate. They conserve leverage. They negotiate silence for leniency, discretion for survival. But when the outcome is final, the rules change. According to multiple observers, that's when institutions start to worry. Not because something new has happened, but because incentives have disappeared. And with incentives gone, unpredictability takes over. Here's the contradiction that keeps resurfacing in private conversations. If Maxwell truly had nothing meaningful to offer, why would anyone still care what she remembers? Why would rumors about unnamed lists cause closed-door meetings, legal reviews, and sudden media caution? Why would an institution that has survived scandals for centuries react to whispers? The answer insiders keep circling back to is this. Because she wasn't just present. She was positioned. Maxwell wasn't a background figure drifting through rooms unnoticed. She was often the one doing the introductions, the one smoothing interactions, the one bridging worlds that rarely overlap publicly. That role matters, because the person who connects people understands context. They understand intention. They understand who wanted access and who was offering it. And more importantly, they understand who benefited from plausible deniability. This is where the story becomes less about actions and more about architecture. Power doesn't operate in straight lines. It moves through networks, through favors, through social obligation, through introductions that seem harmless in isolation but look different when viewed together. And Maxwell, by all accounts, understood that architecture intimately, which brings us to the name the public fixated on. Prince Andrew. For years, he became the focal point, the symbol, the embodiment of everything wrong in the story, a single figure onto whom outrage could be neatly directed. And institutions are very good at surviving when outrage has a single address. Remove the title, withdraw the role, create distance, problem contained. But what happens when attention drifts from one figure to the structure around them? What happens when people stop asking, who did this? And start asking, who else was there? That's when Maxwell's value as a witness, not legally, but narratively, becomes destabilizing. Because she doesn't need to accuse. She only needs to confirm presence. And presence is enough to raise questions institutions hate answering. Here's something that rarely gets discussed publicly. In elite environments, guilt isn't always the greatest threat. Association is. Being linked, even indirectly, to something toxic can end careers faster than any verdict. That's why proximity is managed so carefully. That's why social circles are curated. That's why guest lists matter. And that's why someone who remembers guest lists becomes dangerous. According to sources familiar with crisis response, the concern was never that Maxwell would suddenly reveal crimes. It was that she would reframe narratives, that she would remind people that certain interactions weren't random, that certain meetings weren't accidental, that certain overlaps weren't coincidental. And once those reminders surface, even in vague form, the public does the rest. Because imagination fills in what facts don't provide. This is where the idea of the list takes on power, not as a document, but as a symbol of remembered proximity, a symbol of unspoken connections, a symbol of stories that never made it into courtrooms but live on in collective suspicion. And according to those watching from the inside, the most unsettling part isn't what Maxwell might say. It's what people already believe she could say. That belief alone is enough to destabilize reputations. Because once someone is perceived as holding information, every silence becomes intentional. Every delay becomes strategic. Every denial becomes questionable. Now, introduce a name that amplifies those dynamics. Meghan Markle. Not because she's accused of wrongdoing, not because evidence has surfaced, but because her name exists at a crossroads institutions struggle to manage. Royalty and celebrity. Outsider and insider, visibility and controversy. When her name appears in the same speculative breath as Maxwell's, it creates a narrative explosion. Why? Because narratives don't require proof to gain traction. They require tension. And Meghan represents tension. She represents disruption of tradition, a challenge to hierarchy, a figure people already argue about passionately. Add her to any rumor, and attention multiplies. That's why insiders suggest her name functions less as an allegation and more as a catalyst. It draws eyes, and eyes are dangerous, especially when institutions prefer shadows. This is where the fear escalates. Because if Maxwell is perceived as someone who can link names across worlds, royal, celebrity, philanthropic, then even innocent proximity becomes suspicious. And suspicion doesn't need confirmation to spread. It only needs repetition. Ask yourself this. If you were managing an institution built on continuity, tradition, and controlled narrative, what would scare you more? A known problem you can isolate, or an unknown network people are starting to imagine? The answer is obvious. And that's why Maxwell's silence is louder than any statement. Because silence, when it comes from someone believed to possess information, becomes a form of power. And power, when left unchecked, terrifies systems that rely on predictability. Sources close to the situation describe a subtle but unmistakable shift. Fewer public reactions, more internal monitoring, heightened sensitivity to social media trends. Why? Because institutions learned something uncomfortable. They learned that they no longer control the conversation. The public does. And the public doesn't wait for confirmation. They connect dots. They speculate. They fill gaps. And every gap becomes a breeding ground for theories. That's why the idea of Maxwell knowing too much persists. Not because of what she's proven, but because of what she represents. A reminder that powerful stories don't always die in courtrooms. Some of them survive in memory. And memory doesn't obey legal boundaries. Here's the final irony that insiders quietly acknowledge. If Maxwell truly knew nothing of consequence, she would be irrelevant by now. Forgotten. Ignored. Instead, her name still causes unease. Still triggers reactions. Still lingers. And that lingering presence tells you everything you need to know about how power perceives risk. Because risk isn't always about truth. It's about perception. And perception, once it starts shifting, is impossible to stop. Which brings us to the next realization, one that changes how this entire story is viewed. If Prince Andrew was allowed to fall, if one figure was sacrificed to preserve the whole, then the question becomes unavoidable. Who was he protecting? And was he ever the most important name in the room? Because according to those who've studied the fallout closely, Andrew wasn't the end of the story. He was the buffer. And once that buffer collapsed, attention began drifting outward, toward the wider circle, toward the network, toward the names no one expected to hear whispered. And that's where the real panic begins. What if the most visible fall was designed to stop you from looking anywhere else? That question didn't emerge publicly. It surfaced quietly, in the aftermath, when the noise faded and patterns became easier to see. Because once the outrage settled and the headlines moved on, something felt incomplete. Too neat. Too contained. Too convenient. Think about how the story was framed. One disgraced royal. One catastrophic interview. One symbolic removal from public life. A scandal with a clear beginning, a dramatic middle, and an apparent end. But real power doesn't operate in clean arcs. Real power disperses risk. And insiders argue that's exactly what happened here. Because when institutions face existential threats, they don't defend every piece equally. They prioritize survival. They identify what can be sacrificed and what must be preserved. And sometimes, the most effective defense is a controlled loss. Ask yourself this. Why did the narrative narrow so aggressively around one individual? Why did media focus become so concentrated, so sustained, so absolute? Why did broader questions fade instead of expand? According to observers familiar with crisis containment, that narrowing wasn't accidental. It was strategic. In moments of reputational crisis, institutions follow an unspoken rule. Isolate the damage before it spreads. Create a single focal point. Allow public anger to exhaust itself there. Because outrage, like fire, burns hottest when it has a clear target. And once it burns out, the surrounding structures remain intact. This is where the idea of Andrew as the end starts to unravel. Because if the goal were truth alone, the story wouldn't have stopped where it did. It would have widened. Instead, it contracted. Titles were stripped. Appearances ended. Distance was enforced. Silence followed. Closure was offered, and the public, exhausted, accepted it. But insiders weren't convinced. They noticed something else: a strange absence of curiosity, a lack of appetite for examining the environment around him. The social ecosystem, the recurring overlaps, the repeated proximity of the same circles. Why? Because ecosystems are harder to dismantle than individuals. And that's where the contradiction lies. If Andrew were truly the core problem, removing him would have resolved the three. By allowing him to absorb the fallout, the system reduced scrutiny elsewhere. Attention stayed fixed on one name while others receded into the background. And that's how reputations survive storms. Not by confronting everything, but by controlling where the public looks. Here's where the story becomes uncomfortable. Because when people start asking whether Andrew was ever the center, they inevitably ask who benefited from him being perceived that way. Who gained cover? Who gained time? Who gained silence? And that's when the idea of a broader network starts to resurface. Not a criminal conspiracy, not a proven collaboration, but a social reality. People occupying the same spaces, attending the same gatherings, moving through the same corridors of influence. In elite worlds, that proximity is often enough to create mutual protection, not through explicit agreements, but through shared interest in stability. Stability is everything. Which is why institutions will tolerate a single fall if it prevents systemic collapse. Observers describe Andrew's removal as surgical, precise, decisive, final, and that finality served a purpose. It told the public, this chapter is closed. But it told insiders something else entirely. It told them the system knew exactly where to draw the line. And lines are rarely drawn at random. Ask yourself another question. Why did attention never seriously drift toward the social facilitators? The people who connected worlds. The figures who bridged spaces between royalty, wealth, philanthropy, and celebrity. Those roles are far less visible than titles, but they're far more influential. And that's where anxiety begins to build. Because if Andrew's fall was meant to protect the structure, then the structure itself becomes the real story. And structures don't disappear when one piece is removed. They adapt. They close ranks. They wait. This is where the rumored list gains symbolic weight. Not as evidence of wrongdoing, but as evidence of memory. A reminder that proximity existed beyond what was publicly acknowledged. A reminder that some people were present even if their names never trended. And once the public starts to sense that the story may have been intentionally narrowed, trust erodes. Because people instinctively distrust neat endings to messy scandals. They suspect editing. They suspect omission. They suspect there's more. That suspicion doesn't require proof. It feeds on pattern recognition, on what feels missing, on what feels rushed. And according to analysts who track public sentiment, the belief that Andrew was the end never fully took hold. It was accepted temporarily, but it never settled, which is why whispers continue to resurface, not because new facts have emerged, but because unresolved stories have gravity. They pull attention back again and again. Here's the irony. By isolating Andrew, institutions may have bought themselves time, but they also created a narrative imbalance. Because the moment people suspect sacrifice, they start asking why that sacrifice was necessary. And sacrifices imply protection, which implies value. And value implies others were considered more important to preserve. That realization changes how people interpret everything that followed. Silence stops looking like dignity. Distance stops looking like accountability. And containment starts looking like concealment, even when it isn't. That's the danger of perception. It doesn't care about intent. It responds to optics. And the optics here were clear. One man fell. The system remained. Which leads to the next uncomfortable question. If the system was truly threatened, would it have survived intact? Or was the threat redirected just in time? Observers point out that institutional survival often depends on creating acceptable losses. Losses that satisfy public demand for accountability without destabilizing the whole. Andrew's fall fit that pattern perfectly. High profile enough to absorb outrage. Isolated enough to contain it. Permanent enough to signal consequence. And after that, the conversation slowed. But it never stopped. It just went underground. Into forums. Into comment sections. Into speculative spaces where imagination does what institutions can't control. And in those spaces, the story evolves. It widens. It reconnects dots that were never meant to be connected. Which brings us back to the fear insiders now quietly acknowledge. That once Andrew was removed from the picture, the narrative didn't end. It diffused. It spread outward, toward the idea of a network, toward the possibility that focusing on one figure allowed others to remain unexamined, toward the realization that the story might never have been about a single person at all. That realization terrifies institutions. Because networks are harder to deny, harder to dismantle, harder to explain away. And once people begin imagining networks, they don't stop until they feel satisfied or distracted. And distraction isn't working like it used to. Social media doesn't forget. Algorithms resurface old stories. New generations ask old questions without inherited deference, which means the strategy that worked once may not work again. That's why, according to observers, Andrew's fall wasn't closure. It was containment, a temporary measure, a holding pattern. And now, years later, that containment feels fragile because whispers are returning, not louder, but wider. And when stories widen, institutions lose the ability to control them through individual sacrifice. That's when panic sets in, not because of what's known, but because of what might be asked next. If Andrew wasn't the end, if his fall was designed to protect something larger, then the next logical step is unavoidable. People will start asking who else benefited from the narrative stopping there, and who else was relieved when attention stayed fixed on one name. Because relief, in moments like this, is revealing. And according to those watching closely, that relief didn't last. It was replaced by vigilance, by monitoring, by preparation, because the system understands something crucial. Once the public senses a story was narrowed intentionally, it demands expansion. And expansion is dangerous, especially when names start surfacing not as accusations, but as associations, as remembered proximity, as narrative links. And that's when the story leaves the realm of individuals entirely. It becomes about structure, about who belongs where, about who moved in which circles, about who was introduced to whom, and by whom. And once those questions start circulating, the damage becomes harder to contain. Because institutions can silence individuals, they cannot silence curiosity. Which brings us to the next turning point in this story. Because as attention drifted away from Andrew, it didn't disappear. It shifted toward figures who had never been part of the original narrative, toward names that didn't fit neatly into the existing frame, toward a person whose presence changes the conversation entirely, not because of what she's accused of, but because of what she represents. A bridge, a disruption, a lightning rod. And that's where the story takes its most volatile turn. What happens when a name doesn't accuse, but electrifies? Because that's the moment this story changed tone. Not when a new allegation appeared, not when documents surfaced, but when a single name began circulating in the same speculative conversations, and the temperature spiked instantly. Ask yourself why that happens. Why does one name, more than almost any other, turn quiet murmurs into full-blown arguments? Why does discussion accelerate, positions harden, and emotions flare the moment she's mentioned? The answer isn't evidence. It's narrative gravity. And that gravity belongs to Meghan Markle. Before anyone reacts defensively, pause and consider what's actually happening here. This chapter is not about accusations. It's not about claims of wrongdoing. It's not about proof, documents, or testimony. It's about how stories behave when certain figures enter them. Because some names don't just participate in narratives, they bend them. And when Meghan's name enters a rumor ecosystem already charged with uncertainty, it creates a reaction institutions struggle to predict, let alone control. Here's the contradiction that makes her presence so volatile. On one hand, she's an outsider. On the other, she's uniquely connected. Hollywood access, royal proximity, global visibility. She exists at intersections few people ever occupy. And those intersections are exactly where speculation thrives. Ask yourself this. If a story involves royalty alone, it's contained within tradition and protocol. If it involves celebrities alone, it's absorbed into gossip cycles. But when those worlds overlap, the story becomes uncontrollable. Because different audiences bring different assumptions, biases, and expectations. And when they collide, narratives fracture into competing versions. That's where whispers become dangerous. According to observers, Meghan's name didn't surface as an accusation. It surfaced as a question. How did she know? Who introduced whom? Was she present when? And questions are harder to shut down than claims. Claims can be denied. Questions linger. They invite speculation without requiring commitment. They allow people to imagine connections without asserting facts. And imagination is powerful, especially when it feeds into existing divides. Because Meghan is already a contested figure, people project onto her. They interpret her actions through vastly different lenses depending on their pre-existing views. Some see disruption. Some see ambition. Some see victimhood. Some see strategy. None of those interpretations need evidence to exist. They thrive on perception. And that's what makes her name such an accelerant in a story already fueled by uncertainty. Here's where insiders say the palace's anxiety intensified. Not because Meghan's name added factual risk, but because it added narrative risk. Her presence reframed the conversation from a contained scandal into a cultural conflict. Suddenly, the story wasn't just about past events. It was about power, about race, about class, about access, about who belongs where and who doesn't. And once a story taps into those themes, it escapes institutional boundaries. It stops being manageable. It becomes participatory. Everyone has an opinion. Everyone chooses a side. Everyone believes they understand the truth, even when the truth is undefined. That's the danger of narrative lightning rods. They don't clarify stories. They polarize them. According to those watching closely, the Whisper Network didn't grow louder because of new information. It grew louder because of emotional investment. People weren't just asking what happened. They were asking what they believed happened. And belief doesn't need confirmation. This is where the idea of proximity becomes central. Not action, not involvement. Proximity. In elite circles, proximity is often unavoidable. Events overlap. Introductions happen. Circles intersect. But to the public, proximity feels intentional, suspicious, loaded. And when someone already viewed as controversial is placed near a scandal, fairly or unfairly, the narrative writes itself. That's why insiders insist the danger wasn't legal. It was reputational. Because reputations aren't judged in courtrooms. They're judged in public consciousness. And public consciousness doesn't follow rules of evidence. It follows patterns. Now consider the timing. Why would whispers involving Meghan intensify after Andrew's fall? Because once the primary focus was removed, the narrative vacuum demanded a new center of gravity. And gravity finds mass. Meghan has mass. Media mass. Cultural mass. Symbolic mass. She carries meaning far beyond her actions. Which means when her name enters a story, the story stops being about events and starts being about interpretation. And interpretation is impossible to control. Here's another uncomfortable truth institutions quietly acknowledge. Some figures are too visible to ignore, but too complex to contain. Meghan fits that profile. She's been framed as both insider and outsider, embraced and rejected, defended and criticized, sometimes simultaneously. That ambiguity makes her a perfect vessel for projection. And projections fill informational gaps quickly. According to narrative analysts, once her name began circulating in whisper networks, the conversation changed shape. It wasn't about who did what. It was about who could plausibly be connected. And plausibility is subjective. It depends on what people already believe. That's why denials don't land the same way anymore. Because denials address facts, but whispers address feelings. And feelings are stubborn. Ask yourself this. If Meghan's name were irrelevant, would it provoke such strong reactions? If it added nothing, would institutions even notice it surfacing? The intensity of the response suggests something else is happening. Not fear of guilt, fear of escalation. Because once a narrative becomes symbolic, it can't be resolved with clarification. Symbols don't obey logic. They obey emotion. And Meghan has become a symbol, fairly or not, of disruption within a system that values continuity. That's why her proximity to any controversy feels amplified. Not because of proof, but because of what she represents to different audiences. To some, she represents change. To others, threat. To others, injustice. To others, opportunism. All of those interpretations collide in the same space. And collision creates heat. That heat is what institutions struggle to manage, especially when they rely on quiet resolution. Here's the irony that insiders find most frustrating. Meghan's name attracts scrutiny even when there's nothing concrete to scrutinize, which means silence doesn't calm things down. It intensifies them, because silence around a lightning rod looks intentional, calculated, suspicious, and that perception alone fuels speculation. According to those close to crisis management, the concern was never that Meghan would say anything. It was that others would say things about her. That her name would be used, fairly or unfairly, as connective tissue in a story that refuses to stay contained. And once that happens, the narrative no longer belongs to its original participants. It belongs to the crowd. That's when control slips. That's when institutions shift from response to anticipation. They start asking, what if her name trends next to another name? What if old photos resurface out of context? What if proximity is reframed as intention? Because once the public starts asking those questions, answers stop matching. Perception sets. This is why insiders describe the palace's reaction as cautious rather than defensive. They didn't rush to deny. They didn't escalate. They watched. Because reacting too strongly would validate the rumor. But not reacting at all creates space for imagination. And imagination is relentless. Which brings us to the most revealing contradiction of all. If Meghan's name were irrelevant to the story, it wouldn't keep resurfacing. It wouldn't provoke internal discussions. It wouldn't cause narrative monitoring. The fact that it does suggests something deeper. Not about her actions, but about how stories evolve in the absence of clarity. Once Andrew was removed from the center, the story sought a new anchor. And anchors don't have to be guilty. They just have to be compelling. Meghan is compelling. She polarizes. She provokes. She refuses to be ignored. And that makes her presence in any speculative narrative disproportionately powerful. This is where the whisper network becomes self-sustaining. People talk because others are talking. Speculation feeds on speculation. Each retelling adds texture, not truth. And the more people engage, the harder it becomes to reset the narrative. Because resets require authority. And authority doesn't hold the same weight it once did. That's the new reality institutions face. They no longer control when stories end. They only influence how long they survive. Which leads to the next uncomfortable development. As whispers involving Meghan circulated, another idea began to form. That the story wasn't about one lightning rod. It was about scale, about numbers, about how many names might exist in proximity to the same network. And once numbers enter the conversation, everything escalates. Because numbers imply pattern. Pattern implies structure. And structure implies something far bigger than any individual. That's when the rumored figure, 9, began to matter. Not as a fact, but as a signal. And that signal sent a clear message to those watching closely. This story was no longer about Andrew. It wasn't even about Meghan. It was about how many names the public might start imagining next. And that possibility is what truly unnerves institutions. Because once imagination shifts from singular to plural, containment becomes impossible. And according to insiders, that's exactly where the panic deepened. Because the question was no longer who. It was how many. And once that question takes hold, the list doesn't need to exist. The damage already has. What is it about a number that can make an institution flinch? Not a name, not an accusation, a number. Because the moment a rumor shifts from singular to plural, everything changes. One person can be dismissed. One scandal can be contained. One narrative can be edited. But a number? A number suggests pattern, and patterns are the enemy of plausible deniability. This is the moment insiders describe as the quiet escalation. Not when a new detail emerged, not when a document leaked, but when the conversation subtly changed shape. When whispers stopped circling around who and started circling around how many. 9. Not confirmed, not written, not spoken publicly by anyone with authority. And yet, it lingered. Ask yourself why that matters. Why would an unverified number cause more unease than a verified disgrace? Because numbers imply scale, and scale implies structure, and structure implies something systemic rather than accidental. That's what institutions fear most. An accident can be explained away. A system cannot. According to observers, the panic wasn't triggered by the idea of 9 specific people. It was triggered by what 9 represents. A network large enough to feel intentional. A circle wide enough to feel organized. a pattern too broad to dismiss as coincidence. And once the public begins to imagine a pattern, the story stops being about individuals and starts being about architecture, how things are built, how access is granted, how proximity is managed. That's when institutions lose control of the frame. Here's the uncomfortable truth insiders quietly admit. People don't need a list to believe one exists. They only need to believe that someone else believes it exists. That belief spreads faster than facts ever could, because facts require effort. Belief does not. The number 9 did something psychologically powerful. It invited the public to start counting. Who might be included? Who overlaps where? Who is seen together, photographed together, introduced together? Counting is participatory. It turns passive viewers into active investigators. And once people start counting, they stop listening. They start constructing. This is where the alleged 9 becomes more dangerous than any name ever could. Because names can be denied. Numbers create. A structured rumor invites debate. Debate sustains attention. Attention sustains relevance. Relevance sustains pressure. And pressure is what institutions seek to avoid. Here's another contradiction. If the palace believed the number was meaningless, it wouldn't monitor it. But monitoring suggests concern. Concern suggests perceived risk. Perceived risk suggests vulnerability. And vulnerability invites further scrutiny. This feedback loop is relentless. And it doesn't require bad actors to function. It thrives on curiosity alone. This is why insiders say the fear wasn't about names leaking. It was about numbers sticking. Once a number sticks, it becomes shorthand. People don't say alleged network. They say the 9. Shorthand compresses complexity into something shareable. And shareable ideas travel fast. Ask yourself how often numbers shape narratives. Watergate wasn't about one break-in. Pentagon Papers weren't about one document. Panama Papers weren't about one account. Numbers imply scope. Scope implies seriousness. Seriousness demands attention. This is the logic institutions understand instinctively, which is why the appearance of a number, even an unverified one, changes everything. It forces institutions into a defensive posture without a clear target. You can't refute a number without confirming its relevance. You can't deny a list without acknowledging the idea of one. And acknowledging the idea legitimizes speculation. So silence becomes the default. But silence, in this context, doesn't calm curiosity. It feeds it. Because people interpret silence differently when numbers are involved. Silence around a person can be dignity. Silence around a pattern feels strategic. And strategic silence feels suspicious. This is where the palace found itself in a bind. Responding risked amplification. Ignoring risked escalation. Either way, the number lingered. And linger it did. In forums. In comment sections. In speculative videos. In late-night conversations framed as just asking questions. Questions that didn't accuse. Questions that didn't conclude. Questions that simply multiplied. That multiplication is what terrifies institutions. Because once people start multiplying possibilities, narratives escape containment. This is why insiders describe the moment the number entered circulation as the point of no return. Not legally, narratively. From that point on, the story was no longer about whether something happened. It was about how much might have happened. And that shift is profound. Because how much invites scaling. Scaling invites extrapolation. Extrapolation invites imagination. And imagination doesn't stop at 9. It asks why 9. It wonders if 9 is the floor, not the ceiling. That's when panic deepens. Not because of truth. Because of trajectory. Once a story has trajectory, it carries itself. It no longer needs new information. It only needs repetition. And repetition is effortless. This is the final irony of the alleged 9. Even if it were disproven tomorrow, the idea it introduced would remain. The idea that the story is bigger than one person, bigger than one scandal, bigger than one explanation. That idea can't be erased. It can only be overshadowed. And overshadowing requires something else. Something louder. Something more distracting. Which brings us to the next stage of this unfolding story. Because as the number gained symbolic power, attention began drifting towards something else entirely. Not who might be on a list, but how lists function in elite spaces at all. Who creates access? Who facilitates introductions? Who moves people between worlds? Because numbers imply networks. and networks require connectors. That realization shifted focus again, away from the visible, toward the invisible, toward the mechanisms behind proximity. And once people start looking at mechanisms, not just names, the story enters its most dangerous phase. Because mechanisms suggest intent, and intent is far harder to dismiss than coincidence. According to insiders, this is where the real fear took hold. Not that 9 names would surface, but that the public would start asking how 9 could exist in the first place. And that question doesn't stop with individuals. It stops with systems. What turns a whisper into a crisis? Not proof, not documentation, not a courtroom revelation. Momentum. That's the part most people underestimate. They assume institutions fear facts. They don't. Facts can be addressed, managed, framed, delayed, litigated, buried under process. What institutions fear is velocity. Because once a rumor starts moving faster than the system can respond, control evaporates. And that's exactly what began to happen here. At first, the whispers were fragmented. Isolated comments. Offhand speculation. A question here. A suggestion there. Easy to ignore. Easy to dismiss. But then something subtle shifted. The rumor didn't get louder. It got cleaner. Cleaner narratives are more dangerous than noisy ones. Noise burns out. Clean stories spread. And the story that began to circulate wasn't about guilt. It wasn't even about names. It was about plausibility. Plausibility is the hinge everything swings on. Ask yourself this. How many rumors die because they sound ridiculous? Most of them. How many survive because they sound possible? Enough to make institutions sweat. According to analysts who study narrative contagion, rumors don't need to be believed by everyone to become threatening. They only need a critical mass of people to say, "That wouldn't surprise me." That phrase is lethal. "That wouldn't surprise me" is where curiosity hardens into assumption. And once assumption takes root, denial becomes less effective. Here's how the process unfolds. Stage 1. Novelty. People encounter the rumor and react emotionally. Shock, anger, skepticism. Stage 2. Normalization. The rumor appears again and again. People stop reacting. They start considering. Stage 3. Integration. The rumor becomes part of how people interpret new information. It colors unrelated events. It fills gaps. Stage 4. Institutional pressure. At this stage, it no longer matters whether the rumor is true. It matters that it's shaping perception. That's the point institutions dread. Because perception governs legitimacy. And legitimacy is the foundation of authority. According to observers, the story crossed into stage 4 when it stopped being about revelation and started being about expectation. People weren't waiting to see if something would happen. They were waiting to see how institutions would respond. Silence became data. Timing became suspicious. Every move was scrutinized for subtext. This is where rumors become institutional threats. Not because they expose wrongdoing, but because they undermine confidence. Confidence in process. Confidence in transparency. Confidence in the idea that nothing else is hidden. And once confidence erodes, trust follows. Trust is fragile. It's built slowly and lost quickly. Institutions know this. That's why they invest so heavily in narrative management. But narrative management has limits. It works best when stories are singular and reactive. It fails when stories become distributed. This rumor distributed itself. Across platforms. Across communities. Across ideological lines. People who rarely agree on anything found common ground in curiosity. And curiosity doesn't have an off switch. Here's another uncomfortable reality institutions quietly acknowledge. Rumors are hardest to stop when they're framed as questions. Questions feel innocent. They invite engagement instead of resistance. They allow people to speculate without taking responsibility for conclusions. And once a rumor is question-shaped, it's almost impossible to extinguish. Because answering the question validates it. Ignoring the question suggests avoidance. Either way, attention increases. This is the trap. According to crisis response experts, institutions often underestimate how rumors evolve in decentralized media environments. They assume the public is waiting for official guidance. They're not. They're waiting for coherence. And when institutions don't provide it, people create their own. That's what happened here. The rumor offered coherence where official narratives felt incomplete. It explained why the story felt unfinished, why attention lingered, why silence felt strategic rather than neutral. And once a rumor provides emotional coherence, it becomes resilient. Facts bounce off it. Corrections struggle. Because the rumor isn't filling a factual gap. It's filling a psychological one. People want the story to make sense. They want closure. They want an explanation that aligns with their intuition that something is missing. And rumors are very good at supplying that sense of missingness. This is where institutions face a dilemma. Do they intervene and risk amplifying the rumor? Or do they stay silent and allow speculation to harden? Neither option is clean. Intervention draws attention. Silence invites imagination. There is no perfect response once a rumor reaches critical mass. That's why insiders describe the moment as a loss of maneuverability. Before, the story could be shaped. Now, it could only be reacted to. And reaction is always weaker than initiation. Ask yourself this. Why did every unrelated development suddenly get interpreted through the lens of this rumor? Why did old photos resurface? Why did unrelated events feel newly suspicious? Because once a rumor integrates into collective interpretation, it becomes a filter. Everything passes through it. Neutral actions look strategic. Coincidences look coordinated. Absences look intentional. This is how institutions lose the benefit of the doubt. Not through proof. Through pattern perception. Pattern perception is powerful because humans are wired for it. We look for meaning. We connect dots. We infer intent. Rumors exploit that wiring. They offer just enough structure to feel meaningful without enough detail to be falsifiable. And that's the sweet spot. According to narrative analysts, the most dangerous rumors share three characteristics. They are plausible. They are incomplete. They are emotionally resonant. This rumor checked all three boxes. Plausible because proximity exists in elite circles. Incomplete because details remain undefined. Emotionally resonant because it taps into distrust of power. Once those elements align, containment becomes nearly impossible. This is where institutional panic manifests. Not as chaos, as caution. Meetings multiply. Language tightens. Statements are delayed. Because every word carries risk. And that risk isn't legal. It's interpretive. How will this be read? What will people infer? What will be taken out of context? Institutions begin playing defense against interpretations they can't predict. That's exhausting. And it signals weakness. Because confidence communicates control. Hesitation communicates vulnerability. The public senses that. They may not articulate it consciously, but they feel it. And feelings drive engagement. Here's the most ironic part of the process. The more an institution tries to avoid fueling a rumor, the more the rumor feeds on that avoidance. Because avoidance confirms to some that there's something to avoid. It becomes circular. And once circular reasoning takes hold, logic loses traction. People don't need new inputs. They recycle the same signals. This is why insiders say the threat wasn't Maxwell speaking. It was everyone else talking. The rumor no longer needed a source. It had become self-sustaining. That's the tipping point. When a rumor stops requiring reinforcement, it becomes an environment rather than a claim. An environment shapes behavior. It influences decisions. It changes how people interpret actions before those actions even occur. And institutions operate poorly in hostile environments. They're built for stability, not improvisation. This is why the panic deepened. Not because of imminent exposure, but because the rumor had escaped control mechanisms. It no longer mattered what was true. What mattered was what felt credible. And credibility is earned socially, not officially. Ask yourself this. Why do some rumors collapse overnight while others persist for years? Because persistence isn't about truth. It's about utility. Does the rumor explain something people feel confused by? Does it align with existing distrust? Does it offer a narrative that feels emotionally satisfying? If yes, it persists. This rumor explained why the story never felt finished. It aligned with distrust of elite protection. It offered a narrative of scale rather than isolation. That made it useful. And useful rumors are durable. This is the moment institutions quietly dread. When they realize the story can't be closed. It can only be managed indefinitely. That means perpetual vigilance, perpetual monitoring, perpetual risk, and perpetual risk erodes confidence. Which is why the next shift in this story is so telling. Because once institutions recognize a rumor has become an environmental threat, they change tactics. They stop focusing on names. They start focusing on systems, on protocols, on access, on who facilitates what. Because if the public is beginning to imagine networks, the institution must anticipate which mechanisms will come under scrutiny next. That's when attention moves away from individuals and toward processes, toward how people met, how introductions happened, how circles overlapped. And that shift is far more dangerous than any single allegation, because processes implicate design, and design implies intention, which brings us to the next chapter. Because as the rumor hardened into an institutional concern, focus shifted again, away from speculation, toward structure, toward the unseen machinery that makes proximity possible in the first place. And once people start looking at machinery instead of faces, the story enters its most volatile phase yet. What does an institution do when silence stops working? Not publicly, not theatrically, quietly. Because when rumors harden into environmental threats, the response isn't outrage or denial. It's calibration, measurement, scenario planning, the kind of activity that never reaches a press release but leaves fingerprints everywhere else. This is where the story moves away from personalities and into process. And process is where power lives. According to observers who track institutional behavior, there's a moment when organizations stop asking whether a narrative is true and start asking how it might evolve. That moment isn't loud. It doesn't look like panic. It looks like preparation. Ask yourself this. If you believed a rumor had reached critical mass, what would you do first? You wouldn't address the rumor. You wouldn't repeat it. You wouldn't even name it. You'd prepare for its consequences. That's what insiders describe happening behind palace walls. Not meetings about guilt. Meetings about exposure pathways. Because exposure doesn't only come from statements. It comes from timing, from tone, from absence, from context, from who is seen where and with whom. Exposure can be accidental, and accidents are the hardest to manage. This is why emergency protocols don't resemble courtroom defenses. They resemble chess, multiple moves ahead, anticipating reactions, minimizing angles of attack. And according to those familiar with crisis response, the palace has always excelled at this kind of thinking. But this time felt different, because the threat wasn't linear. It wasn't about one upcoming event or one looming headline. It was about sustained vulnerability, a state where every action could be interpreted through a hostile frame. That's when protocols activate, not formally, not on paper, but culturally. The first shift insiders noticed wasn't what was said. It was who stopped speaking. Suddenly, fewer informal briefings, fewer off-the-record clarifications, fewer background nudges to shape coverage. Silence tightened. Not the dignified silence of confidence, the guarded silence of caution. Why does that matter? Because institutions that feel secure talk more, not less. They engage. They contextualize. They correct. Institutions that feel exposed retreat. They minimize variables. They reduce touchpoints. They limit opportunities for misinterpretation. And that's exactly what observers say they saw. The second shift was subtler. Language. Statements became shorter, less descriptive, more procedural. Where there used to be narrative framing, there was now legal framing. Legal framing doesn't persuade. It protects. And protection signals perceived risk. This is where the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. If nothing had changed, why change behavior? If the story were truly closed, why alter communication strategy? These aren't accusations. They're pattern observations. And patterns are what the public has learned to read. Here's another quiet change insiders point to. Scheduling. Appearances became more controlled. Associations more deliberate. Proximity more intentional. Not because of any one rumor. Because of cumulative pressure. When institutions sense a narrative turning against them, they reduce randomness. Randomness creates opportunities. Opportunities create interpretations. Interpretations create problems. So randomness gets cut. That's how emergency protocols operate. They don't look like alarms. They look like discipline. Ask yourself this. Why would an institution that prides itself on tradition suddenly feel the need to overmanage optics? Because tradition depends on assumption. Assumption that people will interpret actions charitably. That assumption weakens under sustained suspicion. And suspicion was now in the air. This is where the idea of containment mode starts circulating among analysts. Containment doesn't mean stopping something from escaping. It means limiting what can be affected if it does. Think of it like compartmentalization. If one compartment fails, the others remain sealed. This is standard crisis logic, but it also reveals something important. Containment only makes sense when you believe there's something to contain. That's the paradox. Publicly, there was nothing to respond to. Privately, there was enough uncertainty to justify preparation. This duality is what fuels speculation, because the public senses the difference. They may not know what's happening, but they know something is, and that awareness becomes a story in itself. Here's how emergency protocols quietly manifest in practice. Information flow tightens, not because there's something new to hide, but because every additional voice increases interpretive risk. Fewer people authorized to speak means fewer ways a message can be misread, but it also means fewer human moments. And humans are what build trust. This is the trade-off institutions make under pressure. They choose control over connection. It's rational, and it's revealing. Observers also note a heightened sensitivity to third-party commentary, not direct accusations. Context. Who says what? Where? When? Because context can amplify narratives faster than facts. A single remark in the wrong setting can reignite speculation. So remarks are reduced, neutralized, scripted. That scripting is invisible to most people, but it shows up in tone, in repetition, in the absence of spontaneity. And the absence of spontaneity signals fear of misinterpretation. Fear doesn't have to be dramatic to be powerful.